everybody. I'm Nicole Harris-Roberts with Vinyl, and I'm joined here by Sarah Wachter-Betcher. She is going to talk to us today about courageous leadership in difficult times. Sarah, welcome to Boise Startup Week.
Thank you so much, Nicole, and thank you all for listening in today. I'm really excited to be here, and I want to start out by talking a little bit about what I do and sort of why I'm talking to you about leadership in difficult times. So I run a company called Active Voice, where we do leadership programs and coaching for people in tech and design. And I started this practice just this year after spending a lot of years as a consultant in UX and product strategy and content strategy. And I wrote books about how tech and design could harm or hurt people. And so in 2017, after my book Technically Wrong came out, I spent a lot of time giving talks at events, going to visit companies, speaking at universities, really going all over the world, talking to people about the ways that sexism or racism could get built into tech products. And I talked about ethics and responsibility and diversity and inclusion and responsibility and all these things that I cared so much about and care so much about. And I loved it. But after a while, I kept noticing the same thing happening over and over again. The same thing kept coming up, and it ended up shifting the entire arc of my career. And that was this statement: I want to change my organization, but I don't have a seat at the table. I want to be more inclusive in how we work. I want to be more equitable. I want to build a more diverse company, but I don't have a seat at the table. I heard it so many times, I started looking into this. Where is all this coming from? What does this mean? And I actually found that in the 2019 design census from Google and AIGA, which is this huge survey of designers of all sorts, they ask about some of the top issues that are facing design today. And what they found in 2019 is that actually the number 2 response designers had was that they didn't have a seat at the table. That was the second biggest problem they were facing in their roles. And it's been similar in past years too. And so I started looking at that and I was wondering, well, what happens when people don't have a seat at the table? And I realized this is about not feeling powerful. And that when people don't feel powerful in their work, what was happening is that they would shut down and make themselves small, close themselves off from change. I started noticing that this was sort of a form of self-protection, where standing up is scary, speaking up is scary, saying, hey, I think this is a bad decision because I think that this could hurt someone. That can be really, really scary. And so in the face of that fear, it's often a lot easier to run away or to point the finger elsewhere. Even if you really want to make change, even if you believe that equity is really important in a design or a tech org, if you feel like you don't have any power, it's very easy to just step away from it. And so what that led me to is to start re-envisioning the work that I do and really shifting from working on products and projects to working closely with people. Because what I realized is that we need people with a lot more courage in this field. We need people with the courage to stand up and to take action where it counts and to stop leaving their values or their humanity at the door, to stop cosplaying as productive little machines who are only interested in climbing ladders or pushing out products or hitting more tasks in their, Jira system, and to really be willing to speak up for justice or speak up for good wherever they are. And so that is what I wanted to focus on today. That was sort of the talk I wanted to give. How do we be more courageous leaders at work and with our teams, regardless of what role we're in right now? But then a lot of things happened. A lot of things happened over this year. We are in the middle of a pandemic. We are in the middle of a racial justice reckoning. We are in the middle of economic upheaval. We have people working from home in very close quarters. You may have a toddler running into the room right as I give this talk. There have been massive wildfires all over the West. We've got people trying to go back to school, people who are struggling with no childcare, and a huge, challenging election season. It's a lot. There's so much happening right now. Sometimes it feels like just impossible to think about anything else. Maybe you read this article, maybe you saw this passed around a little bit ago, but it really resonated with me. It came out this summer. It's called Your Surge Capacity is Depleted. It's Why You Feel Awful. The author of the piece is Tara Hale. She's a science journalist, and she writes that surge capacity is a collection of adaptive systems, mental and physical, that humans draw on for short-term survival in acutely stressful situations, like natural disasters. The thing is that when it's depleted, your surge capacity has to be renewed. And the problem is that our emergency phase has become chronic. There isn't a clear end to things. Like, it's unclear when everything would be normal again, or even what that means. And so when the emergency becomes chronic, we stay stuck in that place of having used up this surge capacity. And so there we are, right? Feeling these feelings, depleted, overwhelmed, anxious, struggling, just getting by. I bet that almost everybody listening to this is feeling at least one of these, if not all of these at the same time. It's a rough year. And so as we're going through this, as we're experiencing this kind of collective trauma, I think it's really easy to take a moment and be like, well, wait, hold up. You want me to speak up and demand more ethical tech and design systems that are more responsible and fight bias in my work and talk about racism now? Now? And so when that happens, what I think ends up happening is we set up this impossible choice. Either we're depleted and we need rest, we need to take a break, we need flex time, we need looser deadlines, we need fewer responsibilities, shut it all down. Or we need to be leaders who step up and who make change, who push for justice in our organizations, who remove bias from our products, who ensure accessibility is centered at the very beginning. And so that's how the conversations often are framed. Do we do less or do we do more? Either or. And this either or thinking is everywhere, and its effects are so pernicious. We can see it when we talk about this year, right? If you, like me, has been having still a pretty okay year given everything, if you're still employed, for example, if you're still sort of financially solvent and safe, it can be really hard to deal with these feelings where on the one hand, 2020 is unbearable. It is challenging. And on the other hand, you feel like you have it pretty good because you do. And in those situations, this either or, this leads to a place where you can feel really guilty if you start complaining about the difficulties that you've had. You feel like you're not allowed to whine about it because other people have it worse. And so when that happens, what happens is you focus on being grateful. Okay, let's talk about what's good. And that's not a bad thing, right? Thinking about the ways you're grateful is wonderful. But when that's all we're allowed to focus on, what that does is it pushes down all those real feelings we have about what's challenging and what's difficult. Forces us to deny them, to sort of shut them off. And the problem is that it doesn't go away. They lurk under the surface. And that can lead us to burnout. And you can see these things at work as well. You can see these either or scenarios. For example, every time you hear people talk about, oh, we don't need to worry about soft skills, or, oh, all of this chit chat, extra meetings, they're unproductive. Let's get back to work. That's oftentimes looking at things through a binary lens. That work is Kanbans, code, shipping. Everything else is a distraction. You can see it when we talk about diversity. When you hear people say well, I would love to have a more diverse team, but I don't want to lower the bar. That's setting up a binary. It's setting up a binary where either we diversify or we hire the best. And what we miss when we do that, well, we miss everything that diversity might bring that we've never even experienced before. We miss out on new perspectives, ideas. We miss out on strengths that are born of experiences that are different than ours, because we only know the strengths that come from the experiences that are similar to ours. So what we do is we actually miss out on realizing we don't even know what the best is, because we've been hiring according to an outdated understanding of what good even looks like. Ultimately, what I've come to realize is that the binary is very comfortable, and it's comfortable because we grew up with it. Is something good or bad? Are they a hero or a villain? Is someone male or female? We have been trained to see so much of the world through this binary lens and to reduce things down to an either or, to shove things into opposing sides. And so what I want everybody to see today is that we deserve more than two options. We deserve to be able to see a multiplicity of potential paths and different ways of approaching things. But every time we get stuck back in a binary, we lose sight of options. We're forced to pick a side, and it shuts off our creative exploration. It can even lead to indecision, because both options are often bad. And so then we'll try not to choose. And not choosing is also a choice. Not choosing ends up being choosing the default, choosing the status quo, because that's the easiest thing to choose. In fact, because of that, either or thinking has even been called a tool of white supremacy. And I have found this a fascinating thing to learn about. And I really love this example from Cad Smith, who runs a leadership organization called Compass Point. They say that either or thinking prevents us from imagining new ways of being and doing. It creates dynamics of gridlock and stalemate. It forces us into this one of two sides. It forces us into dynamics of us versus them. When I think about that, when I think about gridlock, stalemate, us versus them, what I see is a way of thinking that is designed to keep us stuck, designed to keep us fighting with one another in competition when we don't need to be, designed to prevent us from seeing the world or seeing each other as we actually are, which is messy and complicated and also wonderfully, beautifully human. In fact, you can even think about this when we talk about race itself. You think about the messages you may have received around race. Oftentimes, when we talk about it, what we hear is that you are racist or you're not racist. And in this framing, unless you are an overt, explicit racist, like if you're a person who says, yes, I am a white supremacist, unless you are that person, you're going to want to be in the not racist group, right? If these are your two options, you're going to say, I want to be in the not racist side. And you might even start pulling up evidence that you have of that. Well, I have a Black friend, or, well, I went to a Black Lives Matter protest. I don't have a racist bone in my body. And what this does, this framing, racist, not racist, it allows you to neatly stay in that safe category. You don't have to explore the ways that you, in fact, do uphold white supremacy. And when you can't look at your role in racism with some sense of nuance, with openness, then you can't dismantle it. You can't do anything about it. In fact, when there are only two categories, the good one and the bad one, you will defensively try to stay in the good one. You'll do anything that you have to do to convince yourself and everyone else that that's where you belong. And that is why white supremacy loves a binary, because it doesn't encourage us to look more closely, to think more critically. It encourages us to be defensive and to get stuck in one spot. And so what I want to talk about today is how do we be more courageous in our leadership, in our organizations, with our teams, with one another? How do we be courageous enough to break that binary, to say, I refuse to limit myself and I refuse to limit you to an either or. And I demand better options for the world than just those two. Because what I really think is that when we start seeing that many things can be true at the same time, then we can start actually seeing how we can build solutions that will work for the multiple things that are true at once. Because we can start seeing that not only are we depleted, not only do we need rest from this awful year, but we also need to be responsible for making change. And when we can start to look at it that way, we can even start to see, it's not just that I'm going to be doing both. It's actually that the way that I'm going to make change, that's going to be shaped by the fact that this is a year of burnout and exhaustion and difficulty. We can start going beyond just saying, okay, I'm going to do both, and think, how do I make change in a way that honors and respects and actually understands those difficulties that I'm going through personally and that everybody around me is going through? We can put those things at the core of our leadership practice. And it's a fundamentally human way to look at leadership. And it is how we get to courage here. So to do that, I want to talk about three things. I'm going to talk about three binaries that I think are really worth breaking right now. These are binaries that keep us rooted in place and stuck in fear and sitting back down when we should be standing up. The first one of those is keep pushing versus stop moving. And to talk about this, I want to talk about making decisions, because we are facing a lot of decisions right now. We are facing so many decisions about our day-to-day lives, like what's ethical, what's right, is it selfish for me to get a haircut? I would love to know, right? Like, what are we actually doing on a day-to-day basis? We are making these critical decisions without a lot of confidence that we're making the right decisions. And so when we have to do that, when we have to go through and make an endless number of choices about school and work and everywhere we go, decision fatigue is real. Because when we're faced with this fatigue, we make bad decisions. Like, we make statistically worse decisions. There is a study from a few years ago where they looked at 1,100 cases from Israeli judges. And they started looking at when were people statistically more likely to be granted parole? And they found that there was one big reason that made a huge difference in whether you got parole or not in front of these judges. And it wasn't anything to do with your identity as a potential parolee. And it also wasn't anything to do with the crimes that you may have committed. What it had to do with was when your case was heard. If your case was heard in the morning, you are much more likely to be granted parole. But if your case was heard by these judges in the afternoon, after a long day of hearing cases, you are much less likely to be offered parole. And the reason is these judges were tired. And when we're tired, there's two things that happen. One thing we do is act impulsively, which is like we don't think about the consequences. The other thing we do, which is what the judges were doing, is we stick to the status quo, because the easiest answer that you can have to whether somebody should have parole or not is no. Because if you say no, nothing changes for them. And so sticking to the status quo ends up being a default answer, right? And when we do that, are we serving justice? Or are we just staying in place? And so when we're stuck with this kind of thing, we can get into another binary here. So what do? Do I make bad decisions? Or do I just stop making decisions altogether? Well, one of the hard parts about this is that, not choosing is also a choice. When we choose not to make decisions, okay, I'm just not going to figure that out right now, that can actually make things worse, right? It might feel safer to avoid it, but it makes things worse in our projects, in our companies. Because when we don't make a decision, oftentimes we lower trust. Other people don't trust us as much. Often we don't even trust ourselves as much because we're like, oh gosh, I'm not good at making decisions. When we put off making a decision, we often actually lose out on options too. So there's fewer choices available because we waited so long. So some of the things that could have worked a month ago no longer work. We also end up with a lot of confusion, competing ideas, because what happens is individual people will make ad hoc choices because they have to move on without the overarching decision being made. Those choices end up competing with each other. We delay results, we delay progress. And then when we finally do make that decision, suddenly we're rushing, we're trying to catch up. It's really difficult. And so what do we do about that? Well, what I think is that we need to have the courage to make choices where it counts and the courage to stop ourselves from spinning around where it doesn't count, where it isn't that important. So I like to think about decisions in some categories. And I think about those categories on a quadrant where on one axis, you've got your impact level, so high impact and low impact decisions. And then on the other, you've got your certainty level, high certainty, low certainty. And so I'm going to start in the bottom here, looking at this bottom quadrant of low certainty and low impact. These are distractions. These are decisions that don't need to be made right now, and they are going to waste your time and energy. They're going to waste what little tiny bit of energy you have left at this point, right? This is the kind of thing where you just want to set a date or some sort of future criteria to say, this is when we're going to revisit this, and just set it aside, let it go, get it off the list, because this will keep on draining you and you cannot afford to be drained anymore right now. And then on the other side, also at the bottom, you've got safe decisions. You have a high degree of certainty and it's not that important. This is a great time to either go with your gut and move on, right? Like stop kind of questioning, go with your gut and let it go, or delegate it. Is this something somebody else can decide? Once we have those out of the way, now we're getting to a smaller set of decisions that are a little bit more important to look at. Now, on the side of high impact and high certainty, you can think about crucial decisions. So these are the ones where it's like they really, really matter and you can make them. When you stop and look at them, you can actually make them. You have the information. For these, it's so important to prioritize them and then make sure you're looking at those decisions when you are fresh. So this is like at the beginning of the day, not 4 p.m. Friday, right? These are the decisions that you really want to get out of the way when you have the energy to focus on it. And that's a little different from the other side of the spectrum here on high impact, which is risky decisions. These are important, but you don't really have high confidence. Sometimes we have to make those decisions. And so this is the most important time to slow it down and to explore different paths collaboratively. This is the most important time for getting other people involved, because this is where what you are potentially missing or not seeing could really screw you up later. So this is where you want to think like, okay, this is a high risk decision. What is really great about starting to categorize decisions is that it can really limit how many different things you have to decide. So you're not trying to decide everything. You can let some stuff go, and it can put the appropriate weight on the things that really need to be decided. Because ultimately, you don't have to decide everything. And in fact, not deciding some stuff right now can be a really great way to take some weight off. But at the same time, decisions create clarity for everyone involved. And so deciding some things during a time when people are struggling with so many unknowns, that can actually really help people because it can connect them back to some greater purpose, give them clarity on where they should focus, help them feel like they're a little bit more in control. Everybody could use that right now. That is a gift that you can give people. And so the second binary I want to talk a little bit about is this feeling of powerful versus powerless. So this is another quote from the article about surge capacity. They talked to a family therapist, and she said that the more accustomed you are to solving problems, to getting things done, the more accustomed you are to having a routine, the harder it is on you because none of that is possible right now. And so you get feelings of hopelessness and helplessness. I read that and I was just like, well, I feel attacked. How dare you? How dare you? Because I will tell you, I spent March and April kind of freaking out. Like, I have just completely blown up my business and done this new thing. And maybe I've made a terrible mistake and I should have stuck to safe projects and this is hopeless. And what am I even doing here? I mean, like, it was a lot, right? But you see, as soon as you go down that path, as soon as you start spiraling down that direction, you have just put yourself right into a new binary. That binary is that you are either powerful or powerless. So when we live in that binary, we will almost always put ourselves on the side of powerlessness. Because when you think of yourself as powerless, it feels bad. Like, it doesn't feel great, but it feels easy because it's the status quo. You're not called upon to do anything from a place of powerlessness. You can just sit there. You can say, I don't have a seat at the table. You can opt out. And so instead of asking, do I have power? What I want everyone to be asking is, where do I have power? It's a subtle one-word change, but it makes a massive difference in the answer because a yes-no question, do I have power? They'll frequently answer no. No is easy, right? Where do I have power? That takes some work. That takes you on a journey. You have to think it through. For example, I don't know how many of you have heard about the shift that's been going on in a lot of software companies, including at GitHub, where like everybody's code is held, right, in these repositories, to change language, to really look at replacing racist or problematic language in their interfaces or in their systems and their style guides. And so GitHub has decided to replace every instance of master with alternative terms because of the master-slave dynamic, right? Okay, so that has been this big conversation point across tech going on for the past couple of months. And my friend, Andy Welfley, he got involved with this. He is a content strategy manager at Adobe, and he was really invested in looking at what was happening in their products. And when he and I first started talking about this, a few things came up that really made this such a great example. The first part is some stuff that's true about Adobe, right? Where they're a centralized team in a 25,000 person company. And so from that place, it is really easy to end up stuck, to say like, well, we don't have the power to make change. How can I make change in this 25,000 person company? I'm just a random manager on one team. What you have to be able to do, though, is to get out of that place of stuck and toward a place of possible. And so what he asked when he started looking at what's possible, where do I have power? What he found was that his team was primed to look holistically across products. So yeah, they can't necessarily change everything, but they've got this perspective. They can look across all the products. They have this language background on the content strategy team. So that means that they can have a more nuanced point of view about racist language and problematic language. So they could go a lot deeper than just looking at the terms master and slave. And also that he had this clout in the content and UX community. He'd recently written a book. He speaks at conferences. He was like, I can do something with this. And so what he did was a bunch of different things that are actually much, much, much bigger than him right now. So what he did is a bunch of things within their products. So doing a big audit, changing the design system documentation. He realized I can't change all the products, but I can change what's in the design system documents that everybody who makes all the products has to use. He was able to start conversations that made the C-suite really interested. He was able to then share with peers at other organizations. And what ended up happening was this massive conversation in a content and UX Slack around anti-racist language, where people started contributing all of these other examples, sharing terms, talking back and forth about how people were handling things, different approaches, what terminology was being settled upon. It became this massive conversation that is going on right now and includes a lot of other work coming out. So, for example, this is from Intuit. These are some new content design standards that they've just recently published around racist language. And it's based on work led by a woman named Sarah Moore, but she actually started doing this work by going to that Slack group where Andy had started the conversation, getting resources, getting feedback, and then being able to create this big organizational initiative. And from there, what's happened? Well, now this guide is being shared back in that same group, and everybody else is able to learn from it, and new people are pulling in. And so what we find is that every single tiny shift like this, it creates space for more change, right? It's not just Andy doing this one thing. It's momentum and it's power that's growing because he decided that something would be possible. And so every single time we do this, we create space. We shift people's norms and expectations. We help people start seeing that, yeah, change actually matters. And yeah, this is a conversation we should have at work. And it also creates space for more change makers, for more people to stand up and speak up to, because they see somebody like Andy having some courage and they think, well, I could do that. They feel a little bit more comfortable, a little bit more confident, and they start seeing their own possibilities. Ultimately, what I find is that when we are feeling stuck, we get burnt out, because when we're stuck, we keep churning. Stuck isn't just not moving, right? Stuck is painful. Stuck is like trying to get loose and you can't. That takes a lot of energy. So stuckness breeds burnout. But when we feel like change is possible, when we feel like there is something possible to do, then we can actually get unstuck. Then we get creative. Then suddenly we have ideas. And that brings me to my final binary I want to talk about today, which is the everything versus nothing binary. And this is so common. I'm going to talk about it a little bit around when we talk about doing anti-racism work in our organizations. Because I listened to this talk from a woman named Rachel Rogers, who runs a business coaching practice called Hello 7. It kind of went viral in June when she saw all these other white women coaches posting black squares on Instagram, and she lost it a little. And she sent out this searing video that is going to stick with me for probably forever. She said, being anti-racist is not convenient. If it doesn't cost you anything, it's not enough. If you're in a position of racial dominance, you cannot create more justice in your organization or in the world without it costing something, without risk. The problem is that humans have a really strong aversion to loss. We have this really deeply human fear around it. For example, in behavioral economics, there's this concept of loss aversion, which is basically that people are much more motivated to not lose $5 than they are to gain $5. So the idea that they might win $5 means a lot less than that they might lose it. And so when we are thinking about things from this sort of fear-based mindset, right? Like that is a way that we end up feeling stuck again, because we don't want to lose something. We're afraid of loss. And particularly, this is something that I think comes up in tech. In tech, particularly, we are often scared of what we might lose, and particularly what we might lose by speaking out or speaking up. There's this article from Ian Bogost in The Atlantic from earlier this year, from the spring, where he talks specifically about the tech industry, and he talks specifically about how it is in Silicon Valley, which influences so much about everything that happens in sort of startup space, right? He talks about, all workers worry about their future, but the ambitious people drawn to tech are almost pathologically reticent about foreclosing future opportunities they don't even know about yet. What he means by that is that people have become so used to thinking about their next move that they're often terrified of becoming unhireable or unfundable because they said the wrong thing. And so this is really common. If you've gotten comfortable at a cushy job, or if you don't want to make waves with VCs, you don't want to lose out on a future of, free lunches and haircuts at your company, whatever it is. It's like when you are so focused on that next move and on whether you're going to be hireable or fundable, what that does is that takes us to a place where we end up being so afraid of losing something, we risk nothing. We'll risk nothing at all. And it's such a common response. We don't want to risk anything. And then we end up back at that binary. We start thinking that that's the choice. Am I risking everything or nothing? When we look at it that way, we are going to trend toward risking nothing because everything is too much, right? If we start thinking that the options are, I'm going to risk whether I am hireable, I'm going to risk like my, financial security, I'm going to risk my entire future. We start going to that place. Of course, we're going to default to not risking anything, because everything else would feel like absolutely unsafe. And so when we do that, when we are stuck in this binary, we don't make change. We don't stand up. We don't be the people that I think we deep down want to be. And so the thing is that worst case scenarios are very rarely actually the most likely scenario. We often just act like it is. We act like it is because, we've thought about them the most. It's actually a cognitive distortion. So what happens is that the more you fixate on the worst case, like, oh my God, if I speak up about racial justice publicly, then everybody is going to think that I'm a little too political and that's too risky, and I'm never going to be able to get another job. Like if we start going down that path, I'm never going to be able to get another job. You think about that over and over, and then it feels likely. And then you think about it some more and it feels even likelier. So the longer we spend churning around in this worst case scenario land, the more we start to believe in it. And so what I like to do is to start thinking about how do we see and evaluate different likely outcomes? Because we got to break that cycle somehow. I like to think about a spectrum of outcomes from the worst to the best case. And now you've probably already been, again, churning around in that worst case scenario land. So what we can start doing is we can start thinking about, what would it actually be if it was a best case scenario? Like maybe you have the best opportunities of your life because you were willing to take a risk and say something bold and memorable. That's one thing. But also there's all these likely outcomes in the middle, right? There's all these things in the middle that are probably like so-so, kind of good, decent outcomes. And when you think about those more realistic outcomes, then what you can do is you can go, okay, well, if that happens, here's how I would mitigate that risk. Or, if that happens, that's okay, I'm willing to live with it. Or, here are some ways that I might prevent that from happening. You can start to problem solve. You can start to get creative. Because ultimately, when we catastrophize, we create helplessness. But when we map our outcomes out, that helps us build courage because things start feeling more achievable. Things start feeling more accessible. You start getting more realistic, and then you can choose how to meet those challenges. Ultimately, what I want to leave you with is this idea that when we start breaking binaries, what we end up with is a sense of abundance. We end up with multiple options. We end up with many, many paths. And I think we all want that. We all want to have many paths forward and not just one, not just stuck into one individual way that we can go. And I think that when we start talking about breaking that binary, when we start talking about getting out of that binary, we can think of it as getting rid of our armor, letting it go, dropping it. Because when we keep that armor up, we protect a status quo that I hope most of us don't believe in. We protect a status quo because we don't have to change anything. Again, saying no is the easiest thing. Doing nothing is the easiest thing. And we don't grow and we don't change in that place. And when we can't change, we stay operating in fear. We can't be vulnerable. We can't connect with other people because we're not vulnerable. All we can do is be defensive. All we can do is be protective of what we have. That leaves us lonely. That keeps us exhausted. And we cannot afford that right now. And so I want to leave you with this quote from Aisha S. Ahmad from the start of the pandemic. She wrote, "Let this distract you. Let it change how you think and how you see the world. Because the world is our work. And so may this tragedy tear down all our faulty assumptions and give us the courage of bold new ideas." I hope this moment tears down that binary thinking that keeps us stuck in place and afraid and immobilized. And I hope that it allows you to start replacing it with the courage to ask the question, what's possible from wherever you're sitting right now? Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah, for this compilation and comprehensive view of so many sources, old and new. Our theme this year for the event is Be Resilient. And I can't think of a more fitting keynote for the tech track that addresses that theme. Thank you so much for your time and your inspirational words today.
Thank you so much for having me, Nicole. Thanks, everyone.